Have you ever wondered what really happens after a giant political system just collapses? Well, today we're jumping into a source that looks at the lingering effects of one of the 20th century's biggest ideologies. It's a journey into what the authors call hungover socialism. And man, does it show how the ghosts of the past are still shaping the world today. So, the story kicks off in modern-day Moscow. And at first glance, it feels totally normal, like any big European capital. You see expensive cars, shops full of stuff, a mix of old and new buildings. The really obvious, in-your-face symbols of the USSR, they seem to have pretty much disappeared. But right under that shiny new surface, the past is still very much alive. The source points to this incredible scene, these long, socialist-style lines of people, all waiting to see the embalmed body of Vladimir Lenin. And it's this exact contrast that gets us to our main idea, this massive hangover from a system that officially died decades ago. Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to follow the path laid out in the source material. We'll start with the monuments themselves, then we'll dig into the big ideas that inspired them, and finally, we'll look at the real-world impact that's still being felt in both Russia and Ukraine.
Right, let's get into the ideology behind those monuments. I mean, you see a giant statue of Karl Marx in Moscow, but what ideas does that thing really stand for? The source breaks it down into three main pillars of his thinking.
First up, we've got the labor theory of value. This is a really core concept. The idea is that an item's value comes from how much work, how much labor it took to make it. And the source points out a huge implication here. If that's true, then any profit a business owner makes is, by definition, just theft, value stolen from the workers who actually created it. But here's where the source offers a really simple critique. Think about it this way. It might take a ton of effort and money to grow an orange in a greenhouse up in Alaska, right? Meanwhile, an orange in Florida basically grows itself in the sun. But when you go to the supermarket, would you pay 6 times more for that Alaskan orange? No way. The source argues value is subjective. It's what you think it's worth. Okay, the second pillar is this idea of alienation. Marx argued that capitalism basically separates people from their own humanity. He thought workers were just stuck in these boring, repetitive jobs, not because it was fulfilling, but just to get by, all while the owners call the shots and rake in the profits. And the final pillar is Marx's theory of history. He didn't just see this as an opinion. He saw it as a scientific fact. He believed history was a series of class struggles that had an inevitable end. Capitalism would shove all the wealth into the hands of a few, wages would drop for everyone else, and eventually the working class would have no choice but to rise up and create a socialist state. So here's the kicker, the source points out. Those big predictions, they just didn't happen. Instead of collapsing, capitalism actually led to rising wages and incredible innovation. And that really brings us to the source's overall critique, summed up perfectly, not by Karl, but by Groucho Marx. So what happens when you actually try to put these theories into practice? Well, now we shift from Marx's abstract ideas to their first big test in the real world under Vladimir Lenin. And as the source shows us, what started as a utopian dream pretty quickly turned into a total nightmare. And the source material does not pull any punches here. It lays the foundation for the Red Terror right at Lenin's feet. It talks about his creation of the secret police, the very first slave labor camps, and his direct orders for mass executions. It even highlights the campaign to wipe out the Cossacks, who were targeted for extermination just for being class enemies. And then there's this number, 5 million. According to the source, that's the minimum number of people who died in the Russian famine of 1921 to 22. And the authors are really clear. This was not a natural disaster. It was a direct result of Lenin's policy of taking all the grain from the peasants, leaving them with nothing. So how did the rest of the world see this unfolding tragedy? Well, get a load of this 1933 headline. It comes from a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, a guy named Walter Duranty. And his reporting, as the source points out, was painting a very, very different and deeply misleading picture of what was actually going on. Because the reality on the ground was just horrific. A second, even deadlier terror famine, this one under Stalin and mostly in Ukraine, killed somewhere between 7 and 14 million people. The source argues that reporting like Duranty's, which called the famine rumors mostly bunk, helped hide one of the worst man-made atrocities of the 20th century from the world. This huge gap between the propaganda and the reality wasn't just about famines. It stretched into every single part of Soviet life. So let's look at another one of the socialist state's big claims,
the emancipation of women. And you're not going to believe this, but this question was the actual title of a column in the New York Times. The argument was that the socialist system, being free from all those capitalist pressures, actually made life more fulfilling for women. So the source material decided to put that claim to the test against the actual data.
So, what did this so-called emancipation actually look like? The data presented by the source is pretty stark. Women made up almost all of the country's most physically brutal manual labor jobs. A staggering 98% of all janitors and street cleaners. The source argues Soviet women weren't celebrating this. They were dreaming of being freed from this kind of work. Now, this is a slide that really reveals a lot about women's health care. With good contraception basically impossible to find, women had to turn to abortion at an unbelievable rate. The source actually cites one expert who estimated that for every single child born in the Soviet Union, the average woman had to go through 5 to 8 abortions. Just think about that. And to get back to that provocative question from the New York Times, the source cites a Soviet sexologist who claimed that 70% of Soviet women had never even had an orgasm. The combination of backbreaking labor, living in cramped communal apartments, and cultural repression, well, the source argues it created the exact opposite of a liberated society. Okay, so the Soviet Union finally collapses in 1991, but the story doesn't just end there. Now we're going to turn to post-Soviet Ukraine to see what the long-term economic hangover looks like, as described in the source. The dream, of course, was a quick jump to a free market. But the reality, as the source lays it out, was this corrupt three-step mess. Huge state-owned industries were put up for sale, but politically connected insiders and mobsters, the new oligarchs, just swooped in and grabbed them for pennies on the dollar. The result wasn't a free market. They just swapped state monopolies for corrupt private ones. And this slide just paints a brutal picture of what happened next. A country totally divided. The source describes a wealthy capital, Kyiv, that's home to all the oligarchs and elites. But outside of that little bubble, Ukraine became one of the poorest and least economically free countries in the world, with an average income of just a couple $1,000 a year. And even after the 2014 revolution, which was supposed to be this new era of reform, the source argues that the old authoritarian habits are hard to break. Liberal reformers like the former Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili you see here ended up getting arrested and deported by the new, supposedly anti-authoritarian government. It just goes to show that hangover was far from over. And that brings us to the most important takeaway. The source argues that the real legacy of the system isn't in crumbling old statues. It's in the deep-seated corruption and the authoritarian habits that stick around long after the ideology itself has failed. And that leaves us with a final, really powerful question to think about. When a system that defined every part of life for generations finally collapses, what truly rushes in to fill that void?